My sister looked me dead in the eye and said the words inside the exact house I had sacrificed nearly 2 years to keep standing. "Get out," she told me, her voice perfectly steady in the candlelight. "Money doesn't make you family." She didn't say it with shame. She said it across a catered table they couldn't afford, into the absolute silence of a room that found her cruelty entirely useful. My name is Ariana Brockton. I am 36 years old, and for nearly 2 years, I have been the silent, bleeding artery keeping my family's facade alive. I arrived at my late grandmother Evelyn's house in Oakville, Missouri, on a Tuesday evening in the dead of winter. The cold was brutal, the kind that cracks windshields and freezes breath to your scarf, but the chill outside was nothing compared to the absolute dissonance waiting for me inside the dining room. This was the house I had secretly saved from the county tax auction. It was the house where I had quietly paid the plumbers to replace the rotting pipes, where I had covered the insurance premiums my mother, Denise, swore she had mailed, but somehow never did. I expected a modest family supper, perhaps a pot roast or a simple casserole, befitting a family that constantly lamented their dire financial straits. Instead, I walked into a banquet of delusions. The dining table, a heavy oak antique Evelyn had cherished, was groaning under the weight of an unearned luxury. There were catered appetizers arranged on tiered slate boards, prosciutto-wrapped figs, artisan cheeses I knew cost $30 a wedge, and fresh floral arrangements bursting with winter lilies and imported orchids that had no business blooming in a Missouri December. Beside the crystal water glasses sat bottles of imported wine, the labels proudly declaring vintages that cost more than the electric bill I had paid on their behalf 3 weeks prior. In the corner, a custom dessert display was being meticulously arranged by a hired server. I stood in the doorway, shedding my coat, doing the math in my head. Hundreds of dollars, perhaps thousands. Money they absolutely did not have, spent on an image they could not sustain. Dinner commenced with the usual exhausting choreography. My younger sister, Sloane, held court. She was 28 and possessed a kind of aggressive, polished charm that she wielded like a weapon. She laughed loudly, poured the expensive wine generously, and spoke of vague, impending successes in her aesthetic consulting business. My mother smiled at her with radiant, unquestioning adoration. My father, Russell, chewed his food with deliberate focus, his eyes rarely leaving his plate. A man who had perfected the art of occupying space without ever taking a stand. I ate quietly, my stomach nodding with every bite of the catered tenderloin. I was the audience. I was always the audience, brought in to witness their performance of prosperity, while privately funding the reality of their survival. The tipping point arrived midway through the second course. A distant uncle, a man who only surfaced for holidays and free meals, raised his glass toward me. He had consumed just enough wine to mistake truth for appropriate dinner conversation. "We really have to hand it to Ariana," he announced, his voice booming over the soft jazz playing from the smart speaker. "Always keeping this family afloat. Evelyn would be proud of you, kid. You have been the rock." The silence that followed was immediate and suffocating. The clinking of silver against porcelain stopped abruptly. The air in the room turned brittle. It was as if he had stood up and cursed in a church. He had spoken the forbidden truth. He had acknowledged the invisible strings I was pulling to keep the roof over their heads, and in doing so, he had stripped away the fantasy they were all working so desperately to maintain. Sloane's smile froze. Denise's posture went rigid. Russell took a sudden, intense interest in his napkin. The hostility rolling off them was palpable. I was not a savior in their eyes. I was a walking, breathing reminder of their inadequacy. The tension hung heavy, souring the rest of the meal. When dessert was finally served, I excused myself to the kitchen to fetch a glass of tap water, needing a moment away from the suffocating glare of my sister. The kitchen was a chaotic contrast to the pristine dining room. Caterers' boxes were stacked haphazardly across the counters, but it was not the mess that caught my eye. It was a thick manila envelope shoved clumsily under a stack of heavy recipe books near the edge of the island. It was not hidden well enough. I recognized the seal of the county clerk. I recognized the stark, bold lettering stamped across the front, declaring urgent language regarding property status. My pulse tightened. I had paid the taxes. I had covered the insurance. There was no earthly reason for the county to be sending urgent notices unless something fundamental had changed without my knowledge. New trouble was brewing, and the sheer panic of an impending disaster clawed at my throat. I picked up the envelope, my thumb brushing over the seal. I did not open it. I did not need to. The weight of it in my hand was enough. I walked back into the dining room, holding the manila envelope by the corner, letting it hang in the air between me and the family I had bankrupted my own future to protect. I stopped at the head of the table. The conversation died instantly. "Why did no one tell me about the latest county notice?" I asked. My voice was entirely calm. It was not a shout. It was a genuine, terrifyingly quiet question. For a second, nobody moved. The hired server conveniently vanished into the hallway. Then, Sloane stood up. She did not look embarrassed. She did not look caught. She looked triumphant. She smoothed the front of her silk blouse, turned her body toward me, and looked me dead in the eye. "Get out," Sloane said. The words dropped like stones onto the polished oak table. "Money doesn't make you family." The breath left my lungs. I waited for the reprimand. I waited for my mother to gasp, for my father to slam his hand on the table and demand respect for the daughter who had kept them out of bankruptcy court. I looked at my mother. Denise did not defend me. Instead, the corners of her mouth twitched upward into a thin, terrible little smile. It was a smile of pure vindication. Sloane had just served as her executioner, saying aloud the exact words Denise had harbored in her heart for years. I looked at my father. Russell cut another piece of meat. He chewed. He swallowed. He performed his usual coward silence, refusing to meet my gaze. He would let me be slaughtered in the dining room if it meant he did not have to face the conflict. In that suffocating silence, the reality of my existence within this bloodline crystallized with brutal clarity. My usefulness had always mattered more to them than my humanity. I was the emergency fund. I was the safety net. But I was not, and had never been, a daughter or a sister they actually loved. The moment I became inconvenient, the moment my presence threatened their delusion of independence, I was entirely disposable. There was no point in arguing. You cannot argue with people who are committed to misunderstanding you to protect their own guilt. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I placed the envelope back on the table. I turned around and walked toward the foyer to retrieve my coat. But as I passed the heavy mahogany sideboard near the entryway, my eyes caught something else. A thick leather trust binder, the one containing Evelyn's estate documents, was sitting half open, pushed carelessly behind a decorative vase. The notice in the kitchen, the binder in the hall, the catered dinner. I pulled my phone from my pocket. Moving swiftly, I snapped a discreet, perfectly focused photo of the county notice sitting on the dining table from a distance, and another of the half-open trust binder. The camera shutter was completely silent. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, buttoned my wool coat against the impending cold, and walked out the front door without looking back. The Missouri night hit my face like an insult. I climbed into my car, my hands trembling as they gripped the freezing steering wheel. I started the engine, blasting the heat as I pulled out of the driveway. Leaving the glowing windows of Evelyn's house behind me, I drove for 15 minutes in complete, stunned silence. My mind was trying to process the sheer audacity of Sloane's cruelty, trying to understand how a family could slice someone open so cleanly and go right back to eating dessert. Then, the dashboard illuminated. My phone, resting in the center console, lit up with a notification. I pulled over onto the shoulder of the dark, icy road. I picked up the device. It was an automated alert from my credit monitoring service, a service I had tied to all family financial matters months ago when I realized I could not trust Denise to manage her own mail. It was a fraud alert. The alert detailed a hard inquiry and a pending transaction tied directly to the equity of the Oakville house. The glowing screen cast a harsh blue light over my hands. Suddenly, The puzzle pieces slammed into place with sickening force. The expensive dinner, the unearned confidence, the brutal, unprompted eviction from the dining room. The insult was not the crime. The cruelty at the dinner table was not an emotional breakdown. It was a calculated eviction. They needed me out of the house. They needed me distracted, wounded, and far away. It was cover for something much, much bigger. They were making a move on the house, and they had just used my broken heart as a smokescreen. I put the car in drive, the lingering sting of humiliation completely replaced by a freezing, terrifying clarity. You do not become a human bank account overnight. The transformation is glacial. It happens in increments so small and disguised by familiar affection that by the time you realize you are drowning, you are the one apologizing for getting the carpet wet. Driving through the freezing dark, listening to the rhythmic thump of my tires over the icy asphalt, I did not just think about the dinner I had left behind. I thought about the decade of small surrenders that had built the stage for it. The collapse of my family's independence did not arrive with a dramatic explosion. It arrived with a slow, grinding deflation. Years ago, my father, Russell, ran a mid-sized residential contracting business. It was never wildly lucrative, but it kept up appearances. Then the market shifted. Contracts dried up, and instead of pivoting or scaling down, he simply let the business bleed out. He traded ambition for a heavy, helpless passivity. He became a man who sighed loudly at the kitchen table, shuffling past due invoices like a dealer shuffling a deck of marked cards, waiting for someone else to call the game. He never openly demanded money. He just cultivated an aura of impending doom so thick that I felt compelled to fix it before the sky fell on us all. My mother, Denise, responded to the financial anxiety by opening an antique booth in a high-end cooperative downtown. She possessed a remarkable talent for confusing spending money with making money. She purchased overpriced, dusty sideboards and tarnished silver sets, convinced she had an eye for hidden treasures. The booth bled rental fees for 3 solid years before folding, leaving behind a storage unit full of unsold inventory and a quiet, festering resentment. The true shift in the family architecture, however, occurred when my grandmother Evelyn's health began to decline. Evelyn had always been the anchor, the one who owned the big house in Oakville outright. But as her mind slipped and her physical needs multiplied, the invisible safety net evaporated. The bills began to arrive, and my parents simply stared at them. I was the one who found the first utility shutoff notice, a glaring pink slip warning that the electricity would be disconnected in 48 hours. I was 26 years old, 2 years into a junior analyst position, making a modest salary that I had carefully budgeted. Nobody else stepped up. My father retreated to the garage to organize his useless tools. My mother wept about how stressful the mail was. So, I paid it, $340. That was the first fracture in the dam. Once they realized I could absorb the impact of a crisis, the crises began to multiply. It started with the emergency medication deductibles for Evelyn. Then it was the property taxes, which had somehow been ignored for 9 months. Then came the home repair invoices, a failing water heater, a cracked foundation pipe, a leaking roof over the sunroom. Whenever disaster loomed, a collective, silent gaze turned my way. And then there was Sloane. My younger sister was charming, image-obsessed, and entirely allergic to the concept of entry-level labor. While I was clocking 50 to 60 hours a week at my firm, Sloane was embarking on a relentless series of creative career pivots. First, it was a bespoke beauty branding venture that required a $2,000 laptop and a massive inventory of organic serums. When that failed to make her an overnight sensation, she pivoted to luxury event styling. That required professional cameras, premium website hosting, and a wardrobe that looked successful. Later, it was social media consulting, which mostly involved her going to expensive coffee shops and posting photos of latte art. Every single one of these eras was quietly funded by my overtime. I took on weekend portfolio reviews. I picked up extra client auditing projects. I funneled my bonuses directly into the gaping maw of my sister's aesthetic ambitions and my parents' foundational neglect. Denise was the architect of the guilt that kept the system running. She never framed my contributions as a permanent necessity. Every desperate plea for cash was wrapped in the language of temporary hardship and noble family unity. It was always just a bridging loan until Russell got a new contract, or until Sloane's brand finally took off. She weaponized Evelyn's legacy with surgical precision. When I hesitated to drain my savings to cover a massive plumbing overhaul, Denise would look at me with brimming eyes and say that my grandmother would want us to stay together, that letting the house fall into disrepair would break Evelyn's heart. The greatest theft, however, was not financial. It was the theft of my own trajectory. 6 years ago, I was offered a highly competitive professional fellowship in Boston. It was my ticket out. It was a chance to build a life entirely defined by my own merits, thousands of miles away from Oakville. I had the acceptance letter sitting on my passenger seat. The night I planned to announce my departure, a severe winter storm caused a massive ice dam on Evelyn's roof. Water poured into the living room, ruining the drywall and threatening the electrical panel. I walked into the house to find my father staring blankly at the ruined ceiling and my mother having a panic attack on the staircase. I knew in my bones that if I moved to Boston, the house would be foreclosed on, the roof would rot, and the family would disintegrate into poverty. I could not bear the guilt of abandoning them to their own incompetence. I called the fellowship director the next morning and declined the offer. Citing unavoidable family obligations, I folded the acceptance letter and buried it in the back of a desk drawer. I stayed, and I paid for the drywall. Over the years, I watched the psychology of my family warp in real time. My initial generosity was met with tearful gratitude, but gratitude is an exhausting emotion to maintain, so they quickly downgraded it to an obligation. They stopped saying thank you and started saying they needed the transfer by Friday. Eventually, obligation calcified into expectation. I was no longer doing them a favor. I was simply paying my assigned share of a life they felt entitled to live. Finally, expectation rotted into pure entitlement. The money I earned was mentally categorized as family revenue. If I tried to set a boundary, I was accused of being withholding. The toll this took on my daily existence was a landscape of small, sharp humiliations. While my coworkers discussed holiday plans and investment portfolios, I lived in a state of perpetual, secret austerity. I wore the same thin wool coat for 5 severe Missouri winters, ignoring the broken zipper because a new coat meant I could not cover my mother's car insurance. I delayed my own medical appointments, skipping dental crowns and physical therapy for a nagging shoulder injury, because my health savings account had been drained to pay for Sloane's business licensing fees. The hardest part was the lying. I became a master of the graceful decline. When my friends planned trips to the coast, or even just a nice dinner downtown, I manufactured endless, breezy excuses. I told them I was focusing on a massive work project, or that I was enjoying a minimalist lifestyle, or that I simply preferred cooking at home. I lied because the truth was too humiliating to speak aloud. I lied because I had exactly $82 in my checking account on a Friday night, and admitting that would mean admitting that my family was bleeding me dry. I kept the secret. I maintained the facade. I absorbed the stress, the debt, and the fear so that they could sleep soundly in a warm house. Gripping the steering wheel as the highway stretched out before me, the pieces of the past decade settled into a cold, unbreakable pattern. I had spent my entire adult life trying to be a good daughter, a supportive sister, the reliable backbone of a family going through a hard time. But sitting at that lavish, catered dining table, I finally understood the terrifying truth. I was never treated like a beloved daughter who helped. I was treated like a civic utility. I was the structural integrity of a condemned building. I was the system that prevented consequences. And the moment I questioned the cost of my own operation, the system decided to shut me down. The silence of room 412 at the downtown business hotel was absolute, broken only by the mechanical hum of the mini-fridge in the corner. I sat at the cheap laminate desk, still wearing my wool coat, the harsh white glow of my laptop screen illuminating my face. It was nearly 2 a.m. Outside the window, the city was empty and frozen, but inside my chest, a cold, methodical engine was just beginning to turn over. I had the fraud alert open on my phone, resting next to the keyboard. I logged into my premium credit monitoring portal, a service I paid $35 a month for, specifically to ensure my parents did not accidentally destroy what was left of Evelyn's credit profile. The dashboard loaded, displaying a glaring red banner. There had been a hard inquiry and a preliminary approval from a secondary lending institution, an online outfit known for processing high-risk, high-interest home equity lines of credit. The target of the inquiry was the Oakville property. I opened the photo gallery on my phone and brought up the image I had taken of the county envelope in the kitchen. Zooming in, the pixelated text on the window of the envelope became legible. It was a preliminary notice of encumbrance, a required county notification when a new lien is about to be recorded against a residential deed. I swiped to the second photo, the thick leather-bound trust binder sitting half open on the mahogany sideboard. My fingers flew across the laptop keyboard. I navigated to the county clerk's digital public records portal. I entered Evelyn's name, the parcel number I knew by heart, and paid the required $2.50 digital search fee with my credit card. The system churned for an agonizing 30 seconds before returning a single, newly filed preliminary document. I clicked to download the PDF. As I scrolled through the pages of the pending loan application, the scope of their audacity began to take shape. They were seeking a line of credit for $175,000 against the equity of the house. I kept scrolling, my eyes scanning the dense legal boilerplate until I reached page 14. The signature page, there, sitting on the line designated for the secondary trustee, was my signature. It was my exact handwriting, looping and precise, written in blue ink. But as I stared at it, the forensic details betrayed the lie. The signature was perfectly horizontal, lacking the slight upward slant I naturally used. It was entirely too clean, showing none of the varied pressure of a real pen stroke. It looked scanned. I leaned back in the chair, the air leaving my lungs in a slow, jagged exhale. It was a forgery. I immediately opened my email client and began running search queries. I dug through months of archived chains, messages I had muted over the past year while trying to maintain the fragile peace I thought we shared. I searched for keywords: loan, equity, bank, notary. Finally, I found a thread from 7 months ago, a forwarded email from my mother with a blank subject line. Attached was a scanned PDF of an old medical power of attorney from 4 years ago, back when Evelyn was undergoing an emergency bypass surgery. My mother had asked for a digital copy for her records. I had sent it without a second thought. At exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, I called Helen Pryor. Helen was a sharp, fiercely intelligent woman in her late 60s who had served as Evelyn's attorney for more than 2 decades. "Ariana," Helen said, answering on the second ring. "You are calling awfully early." "Helen, I need you to pull the master file for Evelyn's trust," I said, my voice eerily calm. "I need to know the exact stipulations regarding the house." I heard the rustle of paper, the clicking of a keyboard, and then Helen sighed softly. "We went over this when she passed. The trust was amended 3 years ago. Evelyn explicitly structured it so that while your mother has the right to reside there, no major financial action, no sale, no loan, no leveraging of the asset can be executed without your notarized, countersigned approval. She knew you were the only one paying the taxes. She gave you the ultimate veto power." "They filed for a home equity line of credit yesterday," I told her, "for $175,000. The county recorded a preliminary notice. They submitted an approval package with my signature on it. The line went dead silent. When Helen finally spoke, her tone had shifted from conversational to strictly operational. "A fraudulent approval package. How did they get your signature?" "The medical directives from 4 years ago," I replied. "They lifted the signature page, altered the header, and appended it to the lending agreement." "That is federal wire fraud, Ariana," Helen warned, her voice dropping an octave. "That is not a family disagreement." "That is a felony." "I know," I said, "but I need to know why. What do they need $175,000 for right this second? I hung up with Helen and turned my attention back to the laptop. If my sister was planning something requiring that much capital, she lacked the discipline to keep it entirely offline. Sloane lived for the aesthetic reveal. I began a methodical sweep of her digital footprint, bypassing her public social media profiles and searching for newly registered web domains and hidden holding companies. It took me an hour and 45 minutes to uncover the truth. I found a locked, password-protected website still in its beta testing phase. The domain name was registered under an LLC formed just 6 weeks ago. The title on the landing page read in an elegant, sweeping font, "The Evelyn Legacy Estate." Beneath the title were professional mood boards and rendered design concepts. Sloane was not just borrowing against the house. She was transforming it. She was quietly launching a heritage wedding content venue. The business model was designed to use our grandmother's home as a curated, high-end backdrop for luxury bridal shoots, influencer content creation, and small private micro-weddings. The requested loan was the seed money to gut the ground floor, rip out Evelyn's antique fixtures, install commercial lighting, and build a massive, unpermitted bridal suite in the sunroom. My mother knew. She had to know. I logged into the shared family cellular account, a plan I had been paying the monthly premium on since 2015. I accessed the administrative dashboard and pulled the raw SMS data logs. While I could not read encrypted messages, I could read the plain texts my mother had sent to my father's outdated phone just 4 days ago. I read the lines on the screen until they burned into my retinas. Denise to Russell. Just ignore the county mail when it comes. It is just temporary bridging until Sloane starts earning from the venue bookings. This will finally change everything for us. Russell to Denise Fine. Just keep the paperwork away from my desk. I do not want to see it. I closed the laptop. The sterile hotel room suddenly felt suffocatingly small. The entire landscape of the previous night shifted, realigning into a picture of breathtaking malice. The expensive, catered dinner, the imported wine, the sudden, unprompted attack from my sister, the calculated silence of my parents. None of it was an emotional outburst. None of it was an accident. It was an administrative strategy. They needed the final phase of the loan to clear. They knew the county would send a notice of encumbrance to the house. They needed to ensure I would not be around to open the mail, ask questions, or review the financial ledgers. So, they orchestrated a slaughter. They hosted a dinner designed to make me feel isolated, let Sloane deliver a wound so deep it would sever my desire to be near them, and counted on my predictable retreat. They weaponized my heartbreak to buy themselves the 48 hours they needed to steal the house out from under me. Money does not make you family, she had said. She was right. Money made me their target. Every instinct ingrained in me by a lifetime of family dysfunction screamed at me to get in my car, drive back to Oakville, and kick the front door off its hinges. I wanted to storm into that house, throw the forged documents onto the kitchen island, and watch the color drain from their faces. I wanted to scream until my throat bled. I wanted the loud, messy, catastrophic confrontation that usually followed their mistakes. But sitting in that quiet, anonymous room, I realized that rage was just another form of participation. Screaming at them meant I was still playing my assigned role in their drama. It meant I was still treating them like a family capable of feeling shame. I reached for my phone. I dialed Helen's office number for the second time that morning. "Helen," I said, my voice stripped of all emotion, reduced to pure surgical intent. "Do not call them. Do not send an email. I want you to immediately contact the lender and flag the application as fraudulent. Freeze every asset tied to the trust. File an injunction against any further encumbrance of the property. And then, I want you to submit a formal request to the court for a full mandatory trust accounting. Ariana, once I file these motions, there is no walking it back," Helen cautioned gently. "The legal machinery will take over." "I know," I replied, looking at the city waking up beyond the hotel window. "Freeze it all. The first cut is never the loudest. The most devastating severance does not happen with a scream or a shattered glass. It happens with a mouse click. Sitting in the dim light of my hotel room, I opened my laptop and began the systematic dismantling of my own exploitation. I did not feel rage. Rage is chaotic, and I no longer had the energy for chaos. What I felt was a cold, empowering need for structure. I was a surgeon sterilizing a theater. I started with the telecommunications portal. I had been paying for the family's unlimited mobile data plan since 2015. There were 4 lines on the account. I transferred my own number to a new, independent provider. Then, I selected the remaining 3 lines. The screen prompted me to confirm the cancellation, warning me that service would be terminated at the end of the current billing cycle, which was in exactly 48 hours. I clicked confirm. Next was the storage unit facility on the west side of town. My mother had been keeping the rotting inventory of her failed antique booth there for 5 years. The monthly fee was $275, quietly deducted from my secondary checking account on the first of every month. I revoked the auto-pay authorization and sent a formal email to the facility manager, stating I was no longer the financial guarantor for the unit and that they should contact the primary leaseholder, Denise Brockton, for future collections. I moved relentlessly down the list. I canceled the premium umbrella insurance add-ons covering my father's truck. I disabled the backup utility payment profiles linked to the Oakville house. I even uncovered a specialized event management software subscription billed at $120 a month, neatly tucked into my credit card statement under a vague vendor name. It was the digital infrastructure for my sister's fraudulent wedding venue. I revoked access, blocked all future charges, and reported the most recent transaction as unauthorized. While I was executing the financial freeze, Helen Pryor was executing the legal one. She filed formal disputes regarding the altered property documents through the appropriate county channels. She lodged fraud alerts with the secondary lending institution and the local clerk of courts, completely stalling the equity transaction. The money was locked. The house was frozen. I then opened a blank spreadsheet. I titled it The Oakville Ledger. For 9 straight hours, I dug through 7 years of bank statements, tax records, and archived emails. I created columns for the date, the amount, the recipient, the stated purpose of the funds, and the actual outcome. I logged every plumbing invoice, every property tax wire, every bridge loan that was never repaid, and every medical deductible I had absorbed. I built a fortress of indisputable data. I was no longer relying on memory or emotion. I was relying on mathematics. By Tuesday afternoon, the delayed effects of my administrative cuts began to hit their targets. The family mobile data pool ran dry, forcing them onto the house Wi-Fi. The group chat erupted. My mother flooded the channel with 14 consecutive messages. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not ask where I was. She weaponized therapy vocabulary, using words like respect and family unity. She accused me of overreacting during a fragile time and demanded I restore the mobile data instantly. Because she had important calls to make regarding her church committee, I read the messages and felt absolutely nothing. I did not type a single letter in response. An hour later, Sloan sent a series of direct voice notes. I played the first one, holding the phone away from my ear. Her tone was completely devoid of panic. Instead, it was dripping with a smug, deeply ingrained condescension. "You are throwing a tantrum," Sloane's recorded voice echoed in the quiet room. "You are just trying to prove a point because your feelings got hurt at dinner. But you will be back by the weekend. You always come back. You are way too sentimental to let Evelyn's house go into default. Turn the cards back on. Ariana, stop being dramatic." She truly believed she still held the remote control to my guilt. She thought my departure was a negotiation tactic. My father tried a different approach. He bypassed the group chat and left a voicemail on my new private number. His voice was hushed, trembling with the manufactured frailty he used whenever he needed a shield. He hinted at new health worries, claiming his blood pressure had spiked dangerously high due to the stress I was causing. He pleaded with me to come home so we could handle everything inside the family. He told me that involving lawyers was a terrible mistake that would ruin our reputation. His message was the most clarifying piece of evidence of all. He did not care that a felony had been committed against me. He only cared that outsiders were going to look at his ledger. He feared public exposure far more than he feared his own wrongdoing. I deleted the voicemail. I closed the spreadsheet. I opened my personal email and navigated to a message I had starred 3 weeks prior. It was an employment offer from Red Mesa Advisory, a boutique risk recovery firm based in Denver, Colorado. They specialized in forensic auditing, identifying hidden liabilities, and untangling the emotional lies people tell around money during corporate mergers and high-net-worth divorces. The managing partner had interviewed me twice. He told me I possessed a terrifyingly precise ability to detect financial rot. He had no idea I had acquired those exact skills by surviving my own bloodline. I had stalled on the offer for nearly a month, paralyzed by the ingrained belief that if I moved 800 miles away, my family would collapse. I clicked reply. I typed out my formal acceptance, agreeing to a starting salary that was 40% higher than my current compensation. I confirmed my start date for the first Monday of the following month. Leaving Missouri did not involve a dramatic speech. I did not drive back to Oakville to throw my house keys on the lawn or deliver a blistering monologue about their betrayal. I was completely done turning my survival into a performance for their consumption. I hired professional movers for a Thursday morning. I packed the clothes I had bought with my own money, the books that had kept me sane, and the quiet, sparse life I had managed to scrape together in the margins of their perpetual crises. I left no forwarding address with the post office, opting instead for a private mail forwarding service. I drove west. The journey took 12 hours across the flat, gray expanse of the Midwest, watching the horizon slowly give way to the jagged silhouette of the Rocky Mountains. I arrived in Denver just as the sun was setting over the peaks. My new apartment was on the 4th floor of a converted industrial building. It was completely empty, smelling of fresh paint and floor wax. The movers would not arrive with my boxes for another 2 days. I unrolled a camping mat on the bare hardwood floor of the living room. I ordered a pizza and ate it, sitting cross-legged in the center of the empty space. There was no Wi-Fi yet. There were no shared accounts. No one in this time zone knew my mother's maiden name, my father's history of failures, or my sister's insatiable vanity. When night fell, the silence in the apartment was absolute. It was a heavy, profound quiet. For the first time in over 10 years, I locked a door that no one else had a key to. I was sleeping in a place where no one could enter to demand a favor. No one could accuse me of being selfish. No one could weaponize my grandmother's memory. No one could hand me an invoice. I lay awake on the floor, watching the amber light from the street lamps stretch across the ceiling. The tightness in my chest, a physical pressure I had carried for a decade, finally began to dissolve. The emotional pivot of my life happened right there on the hardwood. It was simple, but it changed the molecular structure of who I was. For 36 years, I had believed that being essential meant being cherished. I had believed that if I solved enough of their problems, they would eventually have the capacity to love me. But I finally understood the truth. I stopped confusing love with access. They did not love me. They loved what I provided. They loved the door I kept holding open. And now, the door was locked. The deadbolt was thrown, and I was finally on the other side. The transition from surviving to simply living is a jarring physical experience. For the first 2 months in Denver, I woke up every morning at precisely 5 o'clock, my heart hammering against my ribs, waiting for the inevitable phone call about a flooded basement or a maxed-out credit card. But the phone never rang. My apartment on the 4th floor remained perfectly, almost suspiciously, silent. The space was entirely mine. I kept it spare and deeply intentional. There were no inherited antique sideboards collecting dust, no towering stacks of unread mail, no visual reminders of inherited debts. Just clean lines, a low canvas sofa, and tall windows that flooded the hardwood floors with sharp, high-altitude sunlight. At first, this earned calm felt deeply unnatural. I walked around my own living room, waiting for the other shoe to drop. conditioned by 36 years of sudden disasters to believe that peace was just the loading screen for the next emergency. But slowly, the Colorado air began to clear my lungs. I was building a life organized around competence and privacy, rather than emotional extortion. At Red Mesa Advisory, I did not just fit in, I thrived. My new colleagues assumed my razor-sharp ability to dissect forensic audits came from years of prestigious consulting. They did not know it was a survival mechanism. When a high-net-worth client sat across the conference table, twisting a gold pen and lying about where the offshore funds had gone, I recognized the cadence instantly. The emotional lies people tell around money are universal. They use the same defensive phrasing, the same deflection tactics, and the same weaponized victimhood, whether they are hiding millions in a corporate shell company or hiding a past-due electric bill under a recipe book. My supervisors marveled at my ability to detect risk patterns and hidden liabilities. I was promoted to senior risk analyst before my first 90 days were up. I was finally being compensated for the exact hypervigilance my bloodline had drained from me for free. My social life rebuilt itself with the same cautious, solid architecture. I met Calder Reeves on a Tuesday evening while wrestling a heavy grocery delivery up the building's central stairwell. Calder was an architect who lived across the hall, a man with dry humor, perpetually ink-stained fingers, and a profound appreciation for structural integrity. Our friendship developed over shared pots of black coffee and casual, unspoken boundaries. He was the first person in my adult life who never asked me to rescue him from anything. If his car broke down, he called a tow truck. If he had a bad day, he went for a run. He liked honesty, spoke in clear, measured sentences, and possessed a deeply grounding presence. We spent Saturday mornings on the roof deck, him sketching building facades while I read thick financial histories. There was no transactional undertone. It was simply two adults sharing space without needing to consume one another. Then, on the second Wednesday of October, the heavy manicured hand of Oakville, Missouri, reached across the state lines. I checked my secured mail locker after work and found a thick, rigid cardboard envelope waiting for me. The return address belonged to Helen Pryor. I carried it upstairs, the familiar leaden weight of family obligations suddenly pressing down on my chest again. I set my briefcase down, walked to the kitchen island, and sliced the envelope open with a paring knife. It was not a single legal update, it was a dossier. Helen had compiled a fresh packet of horrors. I spread the documents out across the quartz countertop. There were new county violation notices printed on harsh yellow paper. There was a registered letter from the primary property insurance carrier warning of an impending policy cancellation. There were 3 different vendor contracts, all bearing forged, digital signatures attempting to bind the Evelyn Trust to exorbitant commercial liabilities. But the most damning items in the packet were the glossy, color-printed screenshots Helen's paralegal had compiled from the internet. Sloan had not stopped when the home equity loan was frozen. Stripped of the bank's capital, she had simply doubled down on the illusion. Pivoting to the court of public opinion, she had launched a massive social media campaign across 3 different platforms. The family house was now being aggressively advertised as a romantic, historic legacy property, perfectly suited for boutique wedding content and exclusive bridal aesthetic retreats. I stared at the photos. She had rearranged Evelyn's remaining furniture to look like a rustic fairy tale. She had strung cheap, commercial-grade fairy lights across the rotting sunroom ceiling, but it was the captions that made my blood run cold. Sloan was weaving a masterful public narrative of tragedy and perseverance. In long, emotionally manipulative paragraphs, she detailed how she was fighting to keep her beloved grandmother's dream alive, despite unimaginable obstacles. And the primary obstacle she heavily implied, without ever using my legal name, was a cold, estranged family member who was using legal loopholes to steal a grieving family's future out of pure, jealous spite. The comment sections were flooded with hundreds of strangers offering prayers, emotional support, and venomous outrage directed at the anonymous, evil sister trying to ruin a beautiful young woman's business. I moved past the screenshots and picked up the insurance warning. The carrier was threatening to drop all coverage on the property in 30 days. An inspector had driven by the house and noted significant, unpermitted commercial renovations visible from the street. They were gutting the first floor without pulling a single county permit, tearing into load-bearing walls to create open-concept lighting spaces for luxury photo shoots. The reality of the situation hit me with the force of a physical blow. The house was no longer just facing a quiet, administrative debt. It was facing catastrophic commercial liability. If a vendor tripped on an exposed wire, or if an unpermitted ceiling collapsed during a photo shoot, the trust would be sued into oblivion. The entire property could be seized, liquidated, and sold for parts. They were no longer merely irresponsible. They were actively monetizing the very illusion I had spent my entire adult life funding. Standing alone in my quiet, sunlit kitchen, staring at the wreckage spread across the counter, my anger fundamentally changed shape. For the past 6 months, my resentment had been personal. It was the deep, aching hurt of a daughter who realized she was only valued for her wallet. It was the humiliation of being evicted from my own grandmother's dining room. But this new anger was different. It was entirely sober, entirely clinical, and completely devoid of self-pity. I realized that stepping away and cutting off the funding was not enough. My family was like a fire that had run out of oxygen in one room, only to chew through the drywall and find a new source of air in the next. They were using my silence as an operating license. If I did nothing, if I simply stayed in Denver and focused on my own peace, they would burn the house to the ground. They would bankrupt the trust. They would drag Evelyn's legacy through commercial court, and they would systematically destroy my name and legal standing to keep their fantasy alive. I gathered the papers, squaring the edges perfectly. I placed them back into the cardboard envelope. I looked out the window at the distant, snow-capped peaks of the Rockies. The peace I had built here was real, but it was fragile, and it could not survive if I allowed them to keep operating a fraud factory using my inheritance as the collateral. I pulled my phone from my pocket and typed a single, brief email to Helen. Prepare the filings. I am coming back, and we are forcing a supervised mediation. I hit send. The sound of the confirmation chime ringing out loud and clear in the empty apartment. I was done watching them play with matches. It was time to introduce them to the fire department. I did not fly into Missouri with a warning. I did not text the family group chat to announce my arrival, nor did I drive anywhere near the Oakville city limits. Returning to the house would have been a tactical error. Meeting on their turf would have allowed them to retreat to their familiar corners, to weaponize the dining room table or my grandmother's floral couches. They needed the comfort of their own walls to maintain their delusions. I was there to tear the walls down. Instead, I arranged the meeting at a rented corporate facility directly across the street from the county courthouse downtown. It was a windowless, aggressively sterile conference room with a heavy mahogany table, gray carpets, and harsh fluorescent lighting that offered absolutely nowhere to hide. I arrived at 8 a.m. with Helen Pryor. She brought along a neutral financial consultant, a man in a crisp navy suit whose entire job was to verify the mathematics so my family could not accuse me of fabricating the numbers. We sat on one side of the long table. I placed a thick, black binder perfectly in the center of the polished wood. At exactly 9 o'clock, the door opened. My parents walked in first. My mother, Denise, had dressed for a funeral, wearing dark colors and a preemptive expression of deep, maternal suffering. My father, Russell, trailed behind her, his shoulders slumped, his eyes darting toward the emergency exit before he even took a seat. Then came Sloane. She looked radiant, defiant, and dressed for a magazine cover in a tailored ivory blazer. Her engagement ring caught the harsh light as she pulled out her chair. Beside her was Carter Wynn. Carter was her fiancé, a man who owned a lucrative mid-sized logistics company. He smiled politely at me as he sat down. Up until this exact moment, Carter firmly believed he was marrying into a stable, propertied family with a promising heritage estate business. Nobody spoke. The silence in the room was not the suffocating tension of our last dinner. It was the clinical quiet of an operating theater right before the first incision. I did not offer greetings. I opened the binder. We are here because the financial and legal liability of the Evelyn Trust has reached an untenable threshold, I said, my voice entirely flat. I slid the first stack of copied documents across the table. This is the complete ledger. Over the past 6 years, I have personally paid $42,000 in property taxes. I have covered $18,500 in deferred maintenance, including the roof and the plumbing. I paused, letting the neutral financial consultant nod in confirmation. My mother flinched at the gesture. But that is the past, I continued, sliding the next folder forward. This is the present. 3 weeks ago, an application was submitted for a home equity line of credit in the amount of $175,000. The application included a notarized signature page granting authorization from me, the secondary trustee. I placed the magnified forensic copy of the forged signature directly in front of my father. Then, I placed the original, 4-year-old medical power of attorney next to it. The signature was lifted, altered, and attached to a commercial lending application without my knowledge or consent, I stated, looking directly at my sister. In the state of Missouri, this constitutes felony wire fraud. Denise immediately deployed her tears. They welled up in her eyes, spilling over her carefully applied makeup. She looked at Helen, then at the financial consultant, attempting to recruit them into her narrative. "Ariana, how could you do this?" Denise choked out, her voice trembling with weaponized fragility. "How could you drag us into a rented room and humiliate us in front of strangers? We are your family. We are going through a fragile transition. You should have come to the house so we could handle this with grace." "Grace is for mistakes, Mother," I replied, not breaking eye contact. "Fraud requires documentation." Russell shifted uncomfortably in his chair, rubbing his jaw. He refused to look at the forged signature resting inches from his hands. "I did not understand what those bank papers were," he mumbled to the table. "There was so much mail, so much legal jargon. It was just a misunderstanding, just poor judgment. Nobody meant any harm." He was clinging to his vagueness, hoping his lifelong specialty of cowardly incompetence would protect him from criminal liability. Sloane did not cry, and she did not cower. She went strictly on the offensive. She slammed her hand flat against the mahogany table. "You are absolutely psychotic," Sloane snapped, her face flushing with rage. "You are so obsessed with power that you staged this entire corporate intervention just to prove you are the boss. You have always been controlling. You just cannot stand the fact that I'm finally building something successful that does not revolve around you paying for it. You hate not being the center of the room." I let her finish. I let the echo of her accusation hang in the sterile air. Then, I turned my attention to the man sitting beside her. Carter had not said a word. He was staring down at the documents I had distributed. He was looking at the county warnings regarding unpermitted commercial renovations. He was reading the notice from the insurance carrier threatening to drop coverage in 20 days due to unauthorized construction. "Carter," I said quietly. He looked up, his expression completely drained of the polite confidence he had walked in with. "Sloane told you the venue was legally hers to leverage," I said. "It was not a question. She told you the business was fully permitted and that the bridge loan was simply waiting on banking delays." Carter looked at Sloane. "You told me your sister was just a silent beneficiary who lived out of state," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, terrifyingly calm register. "You told me the estate was free and clear." "Carter, do not listen to her. She is just trying to ruin my brand because she is jealous," Sloane pleaded, her polished veneer finally cracking as panic set in. "She is not trying to ruin your brand," Carter replied, picking up the forged signature page. "She is proving you built it on a felony." He dropped the paper back onto the table as if it were radioactive. He realized, in real time, that the elegant heritage business he had been investing his own time and reputation into was nothing more than an uninsured, unpermitted liability resting on a stolen foundation. I pulled the final document from my binder. It was a single sheet of paper, cleanly typed. "I am offering one humane path forward," I announced to the room. "You have 24 hours to cancel all pending event contracts and refund the deposits. You will list the house on the open market within 30 days. You will issue a written, public retraction of the defamatory statements posted online. The proceeds of the sale will be used to clear the outstanding debt and repair the unpermitted structural damage you caused. And every adult in this room will secure legitimate employment to sustain themselves." I pushed the paper toward the center of the table. "If you sign this, I will not press criminal charges for the forgery. I will let the sale of the house close this chapter quietly." My parents stared at the settlement offer. For a brief, agonizing second, I thought my father might actually reach for the pen. But Sloane intercepted it. She snatched the paper, her pride flaring up to consume whatever logic she had left. She sneered at me, completely convinced she still understood the emotional mechanics of my heart. "No," Sloane said, her voice dripping with absolute certainty. "I am not signing anything, and we are not selling. You are bluffing. Ariana, you would never let the house go. Evelyn loved that house. You loved that house. You are just trying to scare us. But you will never actually pull the trigger." She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms, daring me to destroy the only collateral we had ever shared. She truly believed that my sentimentality was a permanent weakness she could exploit forever. I looked at my sister for a long, quiet moment. I felt the last, lingering thread of my familial obligation snap. It did not hurt. It felt like breathing clear air. "I used to love that house," I said smoothly, reaching out and pulling the unsigned settlement offer back across the table. "Now, I just own a controlling interest in its liability." I closed my binder. The sound of the thick cardboard snapping shut echoed loudly in the room. I turned to Helen. "The settlement is withdrawn," I instructed my attorney. "Please notify the county clerk that we are moving forward. File the motion for full court supervision and request the immediate appointment of a permanent receiver." My mother let out a sharp, genuine gasp of horror. Carter Wynne stood up, buttoned his suit jacket without looking at his fiancée, and walked out of the conference room without saying a single word. I remained seated, watching my family realize that the safety net they had spent their entire lives abusing had just been packed up and removed from the building. Once the petition for court supervision hit the county docket, the private delusion my family had been operating under fractured into a public spectacle. They had lost control of the legal narrative, so they immediately pivoted to the only battleground they still understood: public image warfare. When lies can no longer survive in a sterile conference room, they desperately need an audience. Sloane struck first, leveraging her digital footprint. Without Carter's funding or his ring on her finger, he had quietly ended the engagement less than 48 hours after the mediation. She leaned fully into the role of the persecuted visionary. She began posting a series of highly produced, emotionally raw videos from her childhood bedroom. The lighting was always soft, her makeup strategically minimal to emphasize her tears. She spoke directly to the camera, weaving a devastating tale of familial betrayal. She claimed that a greedy, estranged sibling was exploiting a legal loophole to bulldoze our grandmother's legacy. In one particularly viral clip, she stared mournfully into the lens and whispered that her sister believed money makes her God. It was a masterclass in manipulation. The comment section flooded with thousands of strangers validating her victimhood, demanding justice for the beautiful young woman whose dreams were being crushed by corporate greed. My mother, Denise, opted for a more traditional, analog approach. She weaponized her local church circles and the neighborhood garden club. She started a relentless whisper campaign, transforming herself into the tragic matriarch mourning the loss of a wayward child. Over casseroles and post-service coffee, she framed me as the aggressively ambitious daughter who had abandoned her Midwestern roots for a cold, corporate life in Denver. She told anyone who would listen that I was forcing the sale of the family history purely out of personal revenge, punishing them for simply trying to survive a hard financial season. My father, Russell, deployed a different tactic entirely. He worked the phones. He spent his evenings calling my cousins, our extended relatives, and old family friends. He bypassed anger and went straight for patronizing concern. He spoke in hushed, sorrowful tones, claiming that the high-pressure work stress in Colorado had made me mentally unstable. He told my aunt that I had suffered a psychological break, that I was entirely incapable of compassion, and that they were just trying to handle my erratic behavior with love. They were laying a massive trap, desperate for me to step into it. They wanted me to log on, to post rebuttals, to scream in the comments section, or to call my relatives and desperately defend my character. They needed me to engage, because a public brawl would validate their narrative that this was just a messy, emotional family feud. I refused to give them a single syllable. My silence became a black hole that swallowed their drama whole. I did not lock my social media accounts. I simply abandoned them. I did not return the concerned voicemails from confused aunts. I went to work, I drank my coffee, and I let them scream into the void. My absolute refusal to brawl online infuriated Sloane. It drove her to manic levels of posting. By refusing to defend myself, I denied her the dramatic back-and-forth friction she needed to keep her audience engaged. But my silence was not passive. Behind the scenes, the legal machinery was moving with devastating precision. Helen Pryor began archiving every single video, every public comment, and every forwarded email from the church group. She compiled a massive defamation file. Within a week, Helen dispatched sharply worded, certified legal warnings to the worst offenders, including a formal cease and desist letter delivered directly to Sloane's email and physical address, promising severe financial damages if she continued to monetize defamatory claims. The turning point of the public warfare did not come from a lawyer, though it came from an 82-year-old woman named Hester Boone. Hester lived in the brick house directly adjacent to Evelyn's property. She was a quiet widow who spent her evenings sitting on her enclosed porch. 10 days after the mediation, Helen received a padded envelope at her law office. Inside was a digital storage drive and a handwritten note from Hester, stating simply that she did not like what she was hearing at church and thought the lawyers ought to see the truth. Helen called me via video link to share the screen. The drive contained dozens of security camera clips from Hester's property, angled perfectly toward the side driveway of my grandmother's house. The timestamps were damning. They showed a rented moving truck backed up to the side door at 2 and 3 in the morning over the course of several weeks. The grainy night vision footage clearly captured my mother and sister directing day laborers as they hauled out Evelyn's antique grandfather clock, the mahogany writing desks, and heavy, sealed cedar chests. They were not just clearing space for a bridal suite. They were fencing the estate's remaining physical assets in the dead of night. The footage forced a crack in the family's united front. 2 days after Helen submitted the video evidence to the court-appointed receiver, my phone buzzed with an unknown local number. I answered to the sound of heavy, panicked breathing. It was my father. He had bought a prepaid cellular phone just to bypass my block list. He was terrified. The bravado he had used with the extended family was entirely gone. He begged me to understand that he had nothing to do with the late-night removals. Then, desperate to trade someone else's guilt for his own immunity, he offered a confession. He whispered that Denise had not just sold the furniture, she had emptied Evelyn's hidden jewelry box 6 months ago. She had pawned the vintage diamond brooches and the sapphire earrings, blaming their sudden disappearance on the chaos and confusion of the extended family filtering through the house immediately after the funeral. I tried to stop her, Russell pleaded through the static of the cheap phone. I told her it was wrong, but you know how your mother gets. I did not want to cause a fight. I am just caught in the middle. You have to believe me. I am just a bystander in all of this. Standing in my Denver apartment, listening to his pathetic, trembling voice, a profound realization washed over me. I had spent my entire life pitying my father. I had viewed him as a tragic, beaten-down man, a helpless passenger in a chaotic household. But he was not a bystander. He had watched his wife steal his mother's jewelry. He had watched his daughter forge a federal document. He had stood by and watched them bleed me dry for a decade. He had simply specialized in cowardice for so long that he had successfully disguised it as weakness. It was not an inability to act. It was a deliberate, calculated choice to preserve his own comfort at the absolute expense of everyone else. "You are not in the middle," I told him, my voice completely devoid of warmth. "You are exactly where you chose to be." I hung up the phone and blocked the prepaid number. The final blow to their public performance arrived 48 hours later, in the form of a 75-page preliminary report filed by the court-appointed receiver. The receiver had conducted a thorough, unannounced physical inspection of the property, accompanied by a structural engineer and a forensic accountant. The findings, which became immediate public record, were catastrophic. The report detailed stripped original fixtures, missing architectural elements, and gaping holes in the drywall where copper piping had been haphazardly removed to make way for unpermitted plumbing. The contractor invoices Sloan had previously submitted were flagged as entirely fabricated, matching no licensed business in the state. Worst of all, the report confirmed what the insurance carrier had threatened the property was now entirely uninsurable due to hazardous, illegal modifications. The receiver's filing stripped away the last remnants of the emotional family drama. The judge reviewed the report and immediately revoked my mother's right to reside on the premises, citing active destruction of the trust's collateral. The battle was over. The narrative had shifted irreversibly. It was no longer a story about an ambitious sister abandoning her roots, or a grieving family trying to hold on to a legacy. It was a sterile, irrefutable state matter of asset protection, fraud, and severe legal consequence. The audience they had worked so hard to manipulate read the public filings, and the comment sections went dead silent. When the walls of consequence finally close in, the truly manipulative do not surrender. They simply change costumes, with the court's grip tightening and the receiver actively scrutinizing every corner of their lives. My family launched a frantic, highly coordinated performance of working-class reform. For a brief window of time, the illusion was almost convincing. My mother took a part-time job working the counter at a local florist, dramatically complaining about the ache in her feet while making sure everyone in her social orbit knew she was sacrificing her golden years to survive. My father actually signed on as a shift manager at a regional warehouse supplier, leaving the house before sunrise wearing a high-visibility vest like a badge of martyrdom. Sloane's pivot was the most aggressively public. Stripped of her luxury aesthetic, she rebranded her online presence to focus on grit and humility. She posted selfies from the dressing rooms of local thrift stores, wearing oversized vintage sweaters with long captions about how true wealth is found in resilience, not real estate. She spoke of stripping away the material world to find her authentic self. Sitting in my office in Colorado, reviewing the receiver's weekly updates, I felt a dangerous, familiar flicker of hope. For one foolish second, I wondered if the shock of the legal system had actually broken through their entitlement. Perhaps the sheer terror of losing everything had finally forced them to join the real world. That hope did not survive the week. The fatal blow arrived on a Tuesday morning. The forensic accountant retained by Helen Pryor requested an emergency video conference. He did not look amused when his face appeared on my monitor. He shared his screen, pulling up a web page that made my stomach drop into a cold, bottomless pit. It was a crowdfunding campaign. The page was active, fully funded by sympathetic strangers, and had already collected over $19,000. But it was the header image that made the breath catch in my throat. It was a scanned copy of my grandmother's obituary photograph. Directly beneath Evelyn's smiling face was a sprawling, horrific narrative written by Sloan. The campaign did not just ask for money to save a family home. It explicitly accused me, using my full legal name, of elder coercion. The text claimed that I had secretly manipulated a dying woman into signing over the estate, and that I was now aggressively evicting my own grief-stricken parents to finance a lavish lifestyle out west. They were begging the internet for legal defense funds to fight a predatory family member. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking, but it was nothing compared to the financial maneuver the accountant uncovered next. The crowdfunding money was not going to a legal defense fund. The forensic review of the routing numbers revealed that my mother and sister had attempted to wire the incoming donations, along with the last remaining liquid cash in the trust's operational account, directly into a commercial holding entity. The entity belonged to Carter Wynn. They had assumed that because Carter ran a logistics company, his corporate accounts were vast and complex enough to hide a few stray wire transfers. They planned to mask the stolen trust funds as vendor deposits and venue operational expenses, effectively using Carter's legitimate business to launder the money right under the nose of the court-appointed receiver. They severely underestimated the wrath of a man who had narrowly escaped marrying into a crime syndicate. When the forensic accountant flagged the attempted transfer and notified Carter's legal team, Carter did not just block the transaction, he went scorched earth. Furious at being used as an unwitting accomplice to federal fraud, he gathered every piece of digital communication he had ever shared with my sister and handed it straight to Helen Pryor. The evidentiary dump was a goldmine of undeniable malice. There were late-night emails, draft contracts with fake letterheads, and, most damning of all, audio voice memos Sloan had sent Carter months prior. Helen played one of the memos for me over the phone. Sloan's voice was crystal clear, completely lacking the tearful victimhood she performed online. She was brisk, annoyed, and fiercely calculating. "Just ignore the signature discrepancy on page 4, Sloan's recorded voice instructed Carter. I had to use an old medical form from the file box to get the notary stamp to match. My sister is too busy playing corporate savior in Denver to ever check the county ledger. We will have the bridge loan secured before she even realizes the equity is gone." It was the smoking gun. It proved she knew the documents were false from the absolute beginning. There was no misunderstanding. There was no naive mistake. It was premeditated. Surgical fraud. The following Thursday, we convened in the judge's chambers for an emergency hearing. The air in the room was suffocatingly tense. With the criminal implications now extending to wire fraud, money laundering, and digital defamation, the family's lawyer advised them to remain completely silent. But my father, staring down the barrel of personal liability and the very real threat of a prison sentence for his complicity, finally cracked. Put under oath to explain his knowledge of the trust structure. Russell took the stand. His high-visibility warehouse vest was gone, replaced by a cheap, ill-fitting suit. He looked old, terrified, and entirely defeated. When Helen pressed him on why the trust required my signature in the first place, he tried to dodge the question, mumbling about standard legal procedures. Helen slammed a copy of the trust amendment onto the podium. She demanded the truth. My father looked at the floor, his voice barely rising above a whisper. He admitted that the amendment was not a standard clerical update. He confessed that Evelyn had secretly driven to Helen's office 3 years ago to change the terms of the estate specifically to block him and my mother from accessing the equity. "She knew," Russell whispered to the court reporter. "Evelyn knew Denise could not handle money. She knew I would not stop her, and she knew Ariana was the only adult in the family who consistently paid the property taxes on time. She made Ariana the secondary trustee to protect the house from us." I sat at the petitioner's table, my hands folded tightly in my lap, as the emotional center of my entire life flipped on its axis. For a decade, I had believed I was an intruder. I thought I was just a random wallet desperately throwing cash at a sinking ship, trying to buy my way into a family that only tolerated me for my usefulness. But hearing my father's confession under oath, the truth slammed into me with the force of a freight train. I was not a victim of circumstance. I was an assignment. Evelyn had not been blind to their rot. She had seen the exact same greed, the exact same entitlement, and the exact same cowardice that I had. But instead of fixing it, she had quietly drafted a legal document to ensure I would be the one forced to stand in the doorway when the wolves finally came for the house. She had foreseen exactly who would have to protect the property from the family itself. My grandmother had weaponized my sense of responsibility to save her real estate. The judge did not need to hear another word. The gavel came down with a sharp, echoing finality. The ruling was absolute. The judge appointed the permanent receiver with full, unmitigated authority over the estate. All family members were legally barred from entering the property. The judge froze every associated bank account. ordered the immediate takedown of the fraudulent crowdfunding campaign, and authorized the swift supervised sale of the Oakville house to the highest bidder on the open market. As the courtroom cleared, I watched my mother openly weeping into her hands, completely ignored by my father, who was staring blankly at the wood paneling. Sloane refused to look at me. Her jaw clenched so tight I thought her teeth might shatter. Helen squeezed my shoulder, offering a quiet word of congratulations on the decisive victory. But as I gathered my coat and walked out into the harsh daylight of the courthouse steps, I felt absolutely no triumph. There was no vindication. There was no joy in watching the people who raised me get crushed under the weight of their own deceit. Instead, there was only a stark, echoing stillness inside my chest. It was the profound, heavy silence that comes when a lifetime of denial finally runs into a brick wall it cannot charm, manipulate, or forge its way out of. The war was over, but the battlefield was nothing but ash. As the receiver prepared the property for the open market, the social atmosphere back in Missouri underwent a profound and sudden climate shift. The court filings, once strictly confined to the county docket, inevitably leaked beyond the family rumor mill. Aunts, uncles, and second cousins, who had previously scolded me over the phone for abandoning my bloodline, suddenly went completely quiet. The receiver's report was a matter of public record, detailing stripped fixtures and fraudulent invoices. You cannot argue with a forensic audit. The whisper campaigns evaporated entirely, replaced by the suffocating, embarrassed silence of people who realized they had publicly defended undeniable theft. With their audience gone and the legal walls closing in, my parents abandoned their performative public reform and retreated to private desperation. My mother bypassed the lawyers and sent long, rambling emails directly to my secure server. She no longer spoke of her own suffering or church groups. She begged me to stop the impending sale strictly for the sake of my grandmother's memory. It was a fascinating, twisted psychological distortion. In my mother's mind, preserving a physical structure was the only way to honor the dead, even if it meant ignoring the financial crimes committed inside of it. She pretended that memory and accountability were mortal enemies, and that by demanding the latter, I was somehow desecrating the former. My father's approach was entirely different, grounded in the same pathetic transactional cowardice he had perfected over a lifetime. He sent a handwritten letter to Helen Pryor's office, asking her to pass it along to me. He offered to sign whatever legal waivers I wanted. He promised to formally renounce any future claim to the trust or the estate. All he asked in return was one final bridge loan of $5,000 to help him and my mother get through the transition and secure a temporary lease across town. He was literally offering to sell his complicity, still fundamentally incapable of understanding that I was no longer operating a family bailout fund. I ignored them both. I thought the secure silence of Denver would finally hold. But a desperate family always keeps one last weapon in reserve. On a Tuesday afternoon, the receptionist at Red Mesa Advisory paged my office line. She said I had an unannounced visitor in the lobby. When I stepped out of the elevator, I found my sister standing by the glass entry doors. Sloane was not wearing her thrift store aesthetic, nor was she draped in the polished luxury of her failed event business. She was wearing grief like a tailored costume. She had on a stark black trench coat, her hair pulled back severely, her face entirely devoid of makeup. She looked frail, tragic, and fiercely determined. Under her arm, she carried a heavy, ornate wooden box. I led her to a vacant, glass-walled meeting room down the hall, refusing to let her perform in the open lobby where my colleagues were working. She sat across from me and placed the wooden box squarely in the middle of the table. "You think you won," my sister said, her voice a sharp, bitter hiss. "You think you exposed us and saved the day. But you do not even know what you are destroying." She flipped the brass latch on the box and pushed it toward me. It was filled to the brim with yellowed envelopes and folded stationery. "These are Evelyn's private letters," Sloane explained, her eyes locking onto mine with a terrifying, predatory gleam. "I found them hidden in the cedar chest before the receiver locked us out. I read them all on the drive out here." She leaned closer. hoping to deliver the killing blow to my psychological foundation. "She did not love you," my sister whispered, delivering the lie with breathtaking cruelty. "She left you in charge of the trust because she knew you were a reliable workhorse. That is all you ever were to her, a utility. She loved me. She wrote about my creativity, my spirit, how much joy I brought her. She only wrote about your efficiency. You are burning our family to the ground over a woman who only kept you around to pay the bills. If you sell that house, you are just proving you were never really part of the family at all." It was the boldest, most deeply vicious move she had ever made. She knew that financial guilt had failed to stop me. She knew that public shame had failed to stop me. So she tried emotional sabotage. She wanted to break my internal narrative. She wanted me to believe that my entire life of sacrifice had been a transactional joke. Hoping the resulting despair would cause me to cancel the sale just to prove I had a heart. She stood up, leaving the box on the table. She adjusted her black coat, looking down at me with absolute certainty. "The final lock change is scheduled for Friday morning," she said, walking toward the door. "You will call your lawyer and stop the sale before then. I know you will, because you cannot stand the thought of being the villain in a story where nobody even liked you." She walked out of the building, completely convinced I would crack before the week was out. She still could not imagine a world where I did not rush in to save the narrative. I did not open the box in the office. I carried it home to my apartment, set it on the kitchen island, and waited until the sun went down. The Colorado night was perfectly still. I poured a glass of water, sat on a stool, and carefully opened the first letter. The handwriting was unmistakably my grandmother's, looping and elegant. They were unsent letters, diary entries written on the backs of old utility bills and formal stationery. I braced myself for the cold. Utilitarian assessment my sister had promised. I prepared to read the words of a woman who saw me only as a ledger. Instead, I found the exact opposite. I read through the night, page after fragile page. My grandmother did not write about my efficiency. She wrote about my exhaustion. There was a letter dated 7 years ago, written right after I had canceled my move to Boston to pay for the ruined drywall in the sunroom. Evelyn had written, "I watch her carry the weight of her parents' failures, and my heart breaks. She rescues them too often. I fear I've anchored her bright life to a sinking ship." Another entry, penned shortly before she amended the trust, held the deepest truth of all. "I have made her the gatekeeper, not to trap her, but because she is the only one who can see the rot. They will try to consume the house. When that day comes, I pray she finally has the strength to drop the burden. I pray she chooses her own life over their endless hunger." The discovery was the most profound twist of this entire ordeal. It was not a courtroom revelation or a forensic accounting anomaly. It was a soul-level correction of everything I had been taught to believe. When my father testified under oath, I believed Evelyn had weaponized my responsibility to save her real estate. When my sister handed me the box, I feared Evelyn had only valued my wallet. But the ink on the paper told the true story. Evelyn did not want me to save the house. She wanted me to save myself. She gave me the legal authority so that when the final collapse came, I would have the power to walk away cleanly, rather than being dragged down into the rubble. My sister had handed me the very weapon I needed to completely free my conscience, mistakenly believing it was a knife. As the morning sun crested over the mountains, filling my apartment with bright, clarifying light, I made my final decisions. I packed the letters back into the wooden box. I would keep the paper. It was the only inheritance I actually wanted. I opened my laptop and drafted a brief, decisive email to Helen Pryor. I formally authorized the court receiver to proceed with the final sale of the property. There would be no delays and no extensions. Furthermore, I directed Helen to draft a legal addendum regarding my portion of the estate. I explicitly refused to take possession of a single piece of antique furniture, silver, or preserved heirloom allocated to my legal share. Instead, I ordered that everything be liquidated at auction. The proceeds from my half were to be quietly and completely donated to a regional women's recovery and housing fundraiser, explicitly registered in Evelyn's name. I would not allow my grandmother's legacy to be a venue for fraudulent aesthetic weddings, nor would I allow it to be a safety net for my parents' cowardly negligence. It would be used to build a roof for women who actually needed one, women who were rebuilding their lives after financial exploitation by their own families. I sent the email and closed the laptop. I looked around my quiet, empty, entirely peaceful apartment. My sister was wrong. I was not going to crack before the lock change. I was finally, irrevocably, free. The final Friday arrived, draped in heavy, bruised clouds. The air was thick with the metallic scent of impending rain, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the family crises I used to extinguish. I pulled into the driveway of the Oakville house at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. Helen Pryor sat in the passenger seat beside me, and directly behind my car, a white commercial van carrying the court-appointed receiver and his locksmithing staff idled at the curb. I had not wanted to come back to this address. I had wanted the legal paperwork to handle the execution remotely, but Helen insisted that my presence, as the authorized trustee, would ensure there were no last-minute barricades, theatrical delays, or claims of misunderstanding. Walking up the cracked concrete path, the grim reality of my family's collapse was scattered across the covered porch. Denise stood among a chaotic fortress of plastic storage bins, overstuffed garment bags, and poorly taped cardboard boxes. She was crying, but it was not the silent, gut-wrenching weeping of genuine loss. It was her signature performative sobbing. Her shoulders heaved just loud enough to ensure the elderly neighbors across the street, including Hester Boone, could witness her manufactured martyrdom. Beside her, Russell looked entirely hollowed out. He leaned heavily against a wooden porch pillar, his shoulders hunched, staring blankly at the toes of his work boots. He looked physically smaller than I remembered, diminished by the sudden, crushing weight of his own accountability. When I reached the top step, he finally looked up. His eyes were wide with a pathetic, familiar plea. He was finally ashamed, but he was still searching my face, desperately hoping I would step in and carry the humiliation for him, just as I had carried every past due invoice and broken promise. And then there was Sloane. She stood near the front door, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, as if trying to hold herself together. The polished luxury was completely gone. The influencer aesthetic had been violently stripped away by the sheer velocity of her ruined engagement, the collapsed venue business, and the looming fraud investigations. She wore plain denim jeans and a faded wool sweater, but the venom in her posture remained perfectly intact. She watched the locksmith step out of the van carrying his heavy canvas tool bag, and then she turned her gaze directly to me. She made one final, desperate attempt to wield the weapon that had successfully controlled my guilt for a decade. She looked me dead in the eye, her voice trembling with a toxic mixture of hatred and terror, and spat the exact words she had used to evict me from the dining room all those months ago. "Money does not make you family," Sloane said, trying to turn the knife one last time. I stopped on the porch mat. I did not flinch. I did not feel the familiar, sickening drop in my stomach. The words that used to paralyze me with an overwhelming need to prove my worth now just sounded like a pathetic confession of their own poverty of character. "You are absolutely right," I answered, my voice steady and completely drained of anger. "Money never made us family. Truth would have made us family. Loyalty would have. Gratitude would have. But you chose none of those things when it mattered." The absolute finality of that statement hung in the heavy, humid air, suffocating the last remaining embers of their entitlement. The locksmith bypassed us, stepping up to the heavy oak door and sliding his metal picks into the brass deadbolt. The loud metallic click echoed across the porch. Panic finally shattered their pride. "Ariana, just give us $300 for a hotel tonight," Denise begged, her performative tears suddenly turning into genuine, frantic desperation as she lunged toward me. "Just for a few days, until the church committee finds us a placement." "Give us one more week," Russell pleaded, his voice cracking with fear. "Just 7 days to organize a proper moving truck." We cannot leave all of this on the lawn. Sloane uncrossed her arms. Her jaw trembled violently. For the first time in the entire story, the aggressive entitlement vanished entirely, replaced by the stark, humiliating terror of a woman who had finally run out of safety nets and scapegoats. "Please," Sloane whispered. I reached into the inside pocket of my coat. I did not pull out a checkbook. I did not pull out my credit card. I pulled out a thick, sealed manila packet. I handed it directly to my father, who took it with shaking hands. "Inside this envelope are legitimate resources," I told them, my tone purely administrative. "There are contact numbers for temporary housing assistance programs. There are addresses for local county employment counselors. There is a detailed sheet of instructions from the receiver explaining exactly how and when you can reclaim your approved personal belongings from the secure storage facility. That is all I have left to give." Sloane stared at the envelope in my father's hands. The crushing realization that I was truly not going to save them twisted her features into a mask of bitter resentment. "You are enjoying this," Sloane accused, her voice rising over the low rumble of distant thunder. "You love standing there watching us collapse." I looked at my sister, taking in the absolute ruin she had built for herself out of greed and vanity. "I am not enjoying anything, Sloane," I said quietly. "I am simply no longer interrupting your consequences." I turned around and walked back down the concrete path. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall, hitting the pavement with rhythmic slaps. Behind me, the locksmith finished his work, the heavy oak door swung shut, and the new deadbolt engaged with a loud, definitive thud. That was the exact moment the house stopped owning me. The aftermath of my departure was not cinematic. It was merely the slow, grinding reality of gravity finally taking hold of people who had been floating on stolen air. The Oakville house was sold on the open market within 45 days to a young architectural couple who planned to restore it properly, pulling the correct permits and respecting the original foundation. The proceeds cleared the liens, paid the extensive legal fees, and settled the trust perfectly. Without my wallet to artificially inflate their lifestyle, my family scattered into the exact lives they had earned. Denise ended up renting a single, cramped room across town in a boarding house, her antique delusions replaced by the stark, unforgiving math of a fixed income. Russell, absolutely terrified of the receiver's ongoing legal scrutiny, kept his shift manager job at the warehouse supplier much longer than anyone expected. He was finally forced to trade his helpless passivity for a grueling 40-hour work week just to keep a roof over his head. Sloane tried every shortcut she could find, but the local event and vendor community had blacklisted her name entirely following the public court filings. With no capital, no fiancé to fund her lifestyle, and a completely fractured reputation, she eventually moved 2 hours away to avoid the stares. She took a job working as a host at a chain steakhouse outside Springfield, trading her luxury event aesthetic for a polyester uniform and a laminated menu, greeting guests with a smile that never reached her eyes. As for me, the stillness I found in Colorado only deepened into a profound, unshakable peace. I was promoted again at Red Mesa Advisory, stepping into a senior directorship role just before my 38th birthday. I used the liquidated proceeds from my half of the estate, exactly as I had promised, to launch the Evelyn Brockton Trade Scholarship. We funded tuition, certification programs, and transitional housing for women who were actively rebuilding their lives and financial independence after being exploited by their own families. Looking back at the long, dark road that led me out of Missouri, I realized the most powerful thing I ever did was simply walking away from the dining room table that winter night. My revenge was never about ruining them. They were entirely capable of ruining themselves. My revenge was finally refusing to finance the lie. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please leave a comment letting me know where you are listening to this story from, so we can connect and share our thoughts together. I invite you to subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support the channel further by pressing the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.